Look at that price, $9.99. You know it's $10. You've known that since you were a kid. The math takes roughly half a second. You are not being fooled. Between 40 and 95% of retail prices in the United States end in 9. Not some prices, between 40 and 95%. The question isn't whether the trick is obvious. The question is why, after a century of knowing the trick, it still works. Your brain reads the leftmost digit of a price and anchors there before it finishes reading the rest. Not sometimes, every time.
Here's why this is more than a checkout oddity. In a study of over 22 million wholesale used car transactions, cars priced at 79,999 miles sold for about $210 more than cars with 80,000 miles. 1 mile, $210. The car didn't get better, the price didn't change, the left digit changed from a 7 to an 8. That's the entire explanation. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly how that works in your brain, where the trick came from, and why the people who benefit from it have never once been tempted to stop.
Here is the thing that makes this strange. You're not stupid. You know the math. $9.99 is $10 minus 1 cent. The retailers aren't even hiding it. The price is right there on the tag. And yet, in lab studies, people still perceive $9.99 as meaningfully cheaper than $10, not by 1 cent, but by closer to $1. The effect isn't about being tricked into buying something you'd have refused. It's subtler than that. This has been studied since 1936, when a young economist named Eli Ginsberg published a one-page note in the American Economic Review titled "Customary Prices," wondering why 9 endings existed at all. 1 page. 9 decades of study followed it. That's the puzzle. You know the trick. The trick still works.
So here is what's actually happening in your head. When you look at a multi-digit price, your brain doesn't patiently read each digit and then form a judgment. It anchors on the leftmost digit first, tags the whole number as a $9 thing or a 79,000-mile thing, and only then processes the rest. Think of a car speedometer. You glance at it and you instantly know you're in the 70s. You didn't carefully read 7, then 2, then process that it says 72 miles per hour. The left digit told you the category. The right digits were afterthoughts. Same thing at the grocery store. The 9 in $9.99 tells your brain $9 category. The 2 nines after the decimal point, already mostly ignored by the time they register. This only fires when the leftmost digit changes. Dropping a price from $9.60 to $9.59 does almost nothing to your perception. Dropping it from $10 to $9.99 moves the left digit from a 1 to a 9, and that's where the brain stops and refiles the price into a lower category. In 2020, one major study found the effect was a medium to strong influence when you see prices side by side on a tag, and dropped to weak when you're relying on memory. The distinction matters. Standing in front of a display comparing 2 tagged prices, your brain is at its most exploitable. And it isn't a prices-only thing. Thomas and Morowitz tested it with general multi-digit numbers, not prices at all, and found the same pattern. This is not a quirk of shopping. It's a quirk of how the brain reads numbers.
Now, here's the part that gives it the right amount of absurdity. The 99-cent price didn't start as a psychology trick. In 1879, 2 brothers named James and John Ritty filed a U.S. patent for an invention they called an improvement in cash register and indicator. The machine was built to solve a specific problem. Saloon owners couldn't trust their bartenders. Cash was disappearing. The patent specified a bell that rang every time the drawer opened, an audible alert to the owner that a sale had been rung up. And this created an audit trail. Every transaction had to go through the machine. The anti-theft angle is confirmed. The next part comes from historian Bill Bryson, as cited in multiple academic sources, that the design also created an incentive for cashiers to ring up odd prices.
If a price was exactly $1, the cashier could pocket the bill and never open the drawer. But if the price was 99 cents, the customer expected change and the drawer had to open and the bell rang. The mechanism meant to catch a thief in Ohio in 1879 accidentally invented the pricing convention that is now so dominant most people have never noticed it could be otherwise.
It was anti-theft tech, not psychology. The psychology came later, a century later, when researchers started asking why the practice hadn't died with the problem it solved. The first academic paper specifically naming the left digit effect in prices was published in 2005 by Manoj Thomas and Vicky Morwitz. They called the paper Penny Wise and Pound Foolish. 126 years between the practice and the name for it.
Now, here's the number that earns its own moment. Across over 22 million wholesale used car transactions, cars with 79,999 miles on the odometer sold for about $210 more than otherwise identical cars with 80,000 miles. 1 mile, $210. The leftmost digit moved from a 7 to an 8, and, the researchers say, the same bias driving that gap is the same bias running at your supermarket checkout. 1 cent, $200. Same brain, the researchers say, different scale.
So you might assume that 9-ending prices are at least actually cheaper, that the signal is truthful even if the perception is inflated. That turns out to also be wrong. At a Chicago area supermarket chain called Dominick's, across 93 stores and nearly a decade of data, 9-ending prices were actually higher than non-9-ending prices in 22 out of 29 product categories studied. Higher by as much as 18% on average in those categories. Here's how that happened. In 1989, 9-ending prices at Dominick's were actually cheaper than regular prices. The signal was real. Shoppers learned 9-ending means low price. That conditioning got established.
By the mid-1990s, the relationship had inverted. Retailers had figured out the signal still read as discount, even when it wasn't one. The prices went up, the shopper perception didn't follow. Shoppers never noticed. Over 8 years, same stores, the share of 9-ending prices at Dominick's grew from just over half to nearly 3/4 of all prices. Nobody complained. Nobody revolted. The signal that originally meant cheap quietly became the signal slapped on anything.
The trick gets used hardest on people who shop infrequently. One major study found the effect is strongest for light users, people who don't buy a product regularly and therefore lack a memory-based reference price. They're seeing 2 tags side by side. They're relying entirely on the digit. They are maximally in the zone. And retailers can amplify it further just by adding a was $4, now $2.99 reference price. That forces a digit-to-digit comparison and switches even habitual shoppers from their memory-based reference to whatever's on the tag. A meta-analysis published in 2024 looked at 69 studies, 362 effect sizes, and more than 40,000 participants. Here's what it found. The just below prices do reliably improve price perception. The bias is real and consistent, but the effect on how cheap the product seems to be is small, not enormous. Context matters. It does slightly impair how premium the product seems, small and inconsistent across contexts, which is probably why most retailers kept the trick anyway. The bias is real. It is not magic. It doesn't turn a bad deal into a good one. It just quietly tilts your first impression. Every time, automatically, before you've finished reading the number.
Here's who eventually had enough. In January of 2014, Israel's Ministry of Economy banned 9-ending prices. All prices had to end in round numbers. The small denomination coins had been abolished. There was no longer any change to give back. The practical justification for odd pricing was gone. After the ban took effect, shoppers' price recall improved immediately. When the trick was removed, people remembered what things cost better. That's not a coincidence. That's the trick being absent. So, the trick started as anti-theft tech in 1879. Over 63% of prices in that scanner data set ended in 9, far above the 10% you'd expect if price endings were random. The evidence is most consistent with final customers, not the professional dealers, being the ones fooled. One country banned it, shoppers there got smarter. Everywhere else, the sellers who benefit from it are still in charge of the price tag.
That is incredible work, genuinely. A quirk of Dayton, Ohio accounting made permanent by a century of conditioning. And your brain, the same brain you use for everything important, reads left to right and stops when it's close enough. Doesn't even clock the pause, just files the number and moves on. Here's the flip side, and it's just as weird. Sometimes the round price wins. A $100 bill, a consultant's fee of $500, artisan anything. Same brain, opposite bias. That's the next one.